My entire life fit into 2 suitcases, 23 kilograms each. That was the limit the airline allowed, and somehow it was also the limit of what remained from 45 years of my life. The rest had been sold, donated, or left behind in cardboard boxes I no longer had the energy to open. I remember sitting at the gate at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, looking at those 2 suitcases, and realizing something that took my breath away. I didn't own a house anymore. I didn't own a car. I didn't own a single piece of furniture. All I had was a small pension, one that could barely cover my expenses if I had stayed in the United States. Most people who heard my story assumed I had lost everything. Today, looking back, I understand something they didn't. That airport wasn't the end of my life. It was the exact moment my life finally began. Before we continue, make sure you're already subscribed to this channel, and please write in the comments which country or city you're watching this from. I always read them. My name is Susan Reynolds. I'm 72 years old, and for most of my life, I was a librarian in Seattle, Washington. I spent 40 years surrounded by books, by quiet hallways, by the soft sound of pages turning under careful hands. It was a good life, a stable life, the kind of life most people spend decades trying to build. I had a husband once. We were married for 19 years. It ended in divorce, quietly, without drama, the way things sometimes just fade rather than break. We never had children. For years that was a quiet ache, something I didn't talk about much, but as I got older, it became something else entirely. It became a kind of silence that followed me everywhere I went. After the divorce, I threw myself into my work. The library became my world. My colleagues became something close to family. The regular patrons, the children who came in for story hour every Tuesday morning, the old men who read the newspaper at the same table every single day, they became my sense of belonging. I told myself that was enough. For a long time, I almost believed it. Then came retirement. I had imagined retirement for years. I pictured lazy mornings, gardening, finally reading all the books I'd recommended to others, but never had time to read myself. What I didn't picture was the silence. The library had been loud in its own quiet way. Footsteps, whispered conversations, children laughing when they weren't supposed to. The hum of people living their lives around me, even if I wasn't fully part of those lives. My apartment had none of that. Every morning looked the same. Coffee for one, the morning news, a crossword puzzle I did more out of habit than enjoyment, an empty afternoon stretching out in front of me like a hallway with no doors at the end of it. I had friends, of course, but they had their own lives, their own grandchildren, their own husbands, their own routines that didn't include me, not out of unkindness, just because that's how life works. People move forward in their own directions, and sometimes you're left standing still, wondering how exactly you got there. Months turned into years, and somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like I was living. I was simply passing time, waiting for something I couldn't even name. My pension was small, and Seattle is not a cheap city. Every month felt like a quiet calculation. Rent, utilities, groceries, medication, whatever was left over, which wasn't much. I watched the numbers in my bank account shrink a little more every year, and I knew that if nothing changed, I would spend the rest of my life counting pennies in a city that no longer felt like mine. Then, one evening, completely by accident, I came across a video about Americans retiring in the Philippines. I can't even tell you why I clicked on it. I had never been to Asia. I didn't know a single person living in the Philippines. I couldn't have pointed to it on a map 10 years earlier, but something about that video kept me watching. I watched another, then another. Before I knew it, it was 2 in the morning and I was still awake, reading about the cost of living, the weather, the people, the warmth that everyone seemed to describe when they talked about their new lives there. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. Of course, curiosity alone doesn't change a life. Fear has a way of showing up right behind it. What would people think? A woman my age, moving halfway around the world, alone, with no husband, no children, no one to call if something went wrong. Was I being brave, or was I being foolish? I asked myself that question every night for months, and I never got a clear answer. What I did get was a slow, quiet realization. If I stayed in Seattle, the next 10 years would look exactly like the last 10. Coffee for one, shrinking savings, a silence that never seemed to end, and that realization scared me more than any flight to the other side of the world ever could. So I started researching, seriously this time. I made spreadsheets, I compared monthly budgets, healthcare costs, housing prices, visa requirements. I watched videos from people who loved their new life there, and then I watched videos from people who had gone back home disappointed. I wanted both sides. If I was going to make the biggest decision of my life, I owed it to myself to be honest about what I was walking into. One detail made the decision feel less terrifying. I didn't have to commit forever. I could enter the Philippines on a tourist visa as long as I had an onward ticket and extend my stay while I figured out if it truly felt like home. If I ever wanted to stay longer term, there were options like the SRRV, the Special Resident Retiree Visa, that I could explore later. That flexibility mattered to me. After a divorce, after a career that had ended, the last thing I wanted was another life-changing commitment before I even knew if it was the right one. I told my friends first. Most of them were stunned. A few thought I had lost my mind entirely. One of them, Linda, who I'd worked with for 20 years at the library, looked at me across the table one afternoon and said, "Susan, you're 72 years old. What if something happens to you over there?" I didn't have a perfect answer. All I could say was that something could happen to me here too. At least over there, I'd be living instead of just waiting. She didn't understand, not really, but she hugged me anyway and told me to call her every Sunday. The months that followed were a strange mix of excitement and grief. I sold my car. I sold most of my furniture. I donated boxes of things I hadn't touched in years. Every item I let go of felt like letting go of a small piece of my old life. Some of it was easy. Some of it wasn't. I found myself crying over an old kitchen table my ex-husband and I had bought decades earlier, not because I missed him, but because that table had witnessed so many years of my life, and now it was going to a stranger's house where no one would know its story. The night before my flight, I walked through my empty apartment one last time. The rooms echoed without furniture to absorb the sound. I stood by the window, looking out at the same view I'd looked at for years. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I was leaving behind. I was thinking about the woman who would be standing in an airport in Manila in just a few hours, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. I didn't know her yet, but I was about to become her. The flight itself passed in a blur. Hours disappeared somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. I slept a little, watched a movie I couldn't tell you the name of now, and looked out the window far more than I usually would. Every so often I reached into my carry-on, not for my passport, not for my phone, but for a small notebook where I'd written down every reason I had for making this decision. Reading those words, somewhere over the ocean, calmed my nerves more than I expected it to. When the plane finally touched down in Manila, my heart started racing. This was it. There was no longer a plan to make. There was only reality, standing right in front of me. I followed the crowd through immigration, baggage claim, customs. Everything I had spent months worrying about turned out to be surprisingly simple. The immigration officer smiled politely, stamped my passport, and said, "Enjoy your stay." Just like that, I was in the Philippines. Outside the airport, the humid night air hit me immediately. Even at night, It felt completely different from Seattle's cool, gray evenings. There were people everywhere, families greeting one another, drivers holding cardboard signs with names written on them. The sound of a dozen conversations in a language I didn't understand yet. I stood there for a moment just taking it in. 72 years old, 2 suitcases, and no idea what came next. I had arranged a small apartment through someone I'd met online in an expat group. A modest, one-bedroom unit in a quiet area not far from Metro Manila, close enough for hospitals, shopping, and the airport, far enough for a slower pace of life. The first night, I barely slept. The unfamiliar sounds, the unfamiliar heat, the unfamiliar silence of a city that didn't know my name yet. I lay there in the dark, asking myself the same question I'd asked for months. Susan, what have you done? The first few weeks were harder than I expected, not because of the Philippines itself, but because of everything I suddenly had to figure out. How to open a local bank account, how to buy groceries when I didn't recognize half the products on the shelves, how to get around a city with traffic unlike anything I'd ever seen in my life. Some days I felt excited, like I was finally living again. Other days I felt completely overwhelmed. There were mornings when I woke up convinced I was building a wonderful new life, and there were afternoons when I sat alone in my apartment, wondering if I'd completely lost my mind. One week I'd be exploring neighborhoods I'd never seen before. The next week I'd be sitting by myself, missing my old life so much it physically ached. Nobody talks about that part. People tell stories about moving abroad as if it's one single decision. It isn't. It's dozens of decisions, hundreds of them, and most of those decisions happen after you've already arrived. I called Linda every Sunday, like I promised. She'd ask how I was doing, and I'd say, I'm fine, which was only half true. The truth was I was lonely in a new way, a different kind of lonely than the one I'd left behind in Seattle. In Seattle, my loneliness had been familiar, comfortable even. Here, it was sharp and unfamiliar, and it caught me off guard more often than I'd like to admit. But something kept me going. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was pride. I had told so many people I was doing this. I didn't want to go home defeated, not yet, not without really trying. So I forced myself out the door every single day, even when I didn't want to. I walked through the neighborhood. I sat at small cafes. I smiled at strangers, even when I felt like crying. One afternoon, everything changed without me even realizing it at the time. I had walked to a small coffee shop near my apartment, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a handwritten menu taped to the wall. I sat alone, as usual, with a book I wasn't really reading. A young woman working behind the counter noticed me. She'd seen me come in several times before, always alone, always quiet. She asked if I was a teacher. I laughed and said no. I used to be a librarian. Her face lit up. She said she loved books, but couldn't afford many of them. Her name was May. She was studying education at a local university, working at the coffee shop to help pay for her tuition. We talked for nearly an hour that day about books, about libraries, about her dream of becoming a teacher someday. Before I left, she asked me a question that stayed with me for weeks afterward. She asked if I would ever consider teaching English to students like her, even just informally. I told her I'd think about it. I didn't think much would come of it, but that night I couldn't stop thinking about the question. For years, I had helped people find books, find information, find answers. It was who I was, and somewhere along the way, in all my worry about visas and budgets and grocery stores, I had forgotten that part of myself. A week later, I went back to the coffee shop and told May I was interested. She introduced me to a small community center nearby that offered free classes to local residents. The woman who ran it was skeptical at first, a retired American with no teaching experience, wanting to volunteer, but she gave me a chance. 2 afternoons a week, teaching basic English conversation to a small group of adults. My first class was terrifying. My hands were shaking as I stood in front of 8 strangers who had come to learn a language I had spoken my entire life without ever thinking twice. But something shifted in that room. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't just filling time, I was needed. Week after week, that small classroom became something I looked forward to more than anything else in my new life. I learned their names, their stories, a father working 2 jobs, hoping to get a promotion, a grandmother wanting to speak to her grandson who had moved to Canada, a teenage girl named Sophia who dreamed of becoming an English teacher herself one day. Sophia reminded me of myself at that age, hungry for knowledge, unsure if she'd ever get the chance to use it fully. She started staying after class, asking questions about America, about libraries, about what it took to become a teacher. I found myself looking forward to those conversations more than I expected. One afternoon, walking home from class, a thought stopped me right in the middle of the sidewalk. I wasn't waiting for my life to begin anymore. For years, I had been acting as if life had already happened, as if the important chapters were finished, as if the only thing left was to manage the time I had remaining. But standing there in the Manila heat, surrounded by noise and traffic and people rushing in every direction, I realized something. This wasn't a retirement story, it was a beginning, and beginnings are supposed to feel uncertain. Not everyone understood, especially Linda, because around that same time, I made a decision that surprised even me. I signed a 1-year lease on my apartment. When Linda heard about it on our Sunday call, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she was going to visit, not for a vacation, but to see with her own eyes what on earth her old friend was doing. I was nervous, waiting for her at the airport, more nervous than I had been when I landed here myself, because it's one thing to explain your choices over the phone. It's another thing entirely to have those choices standing right in front of you, watching, evaluating, trying to decide if you've lost your mind. When I saw her coming through arrivals, she hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. Then she stepped back, looked me up and down, and said something that made me laugh. "You look different, Susan." I asked if that was a good thing or a bad thing. She stared at me for a second, then shrugged. "I haven't decided yet." That was Linda, always honest. The first few days felt a little like an inspection. Not intentionally, at least I don't think so, but I could see her observing everything. The apartment, the neighborhood, the people I spent time with, the way I moved through the city now like someone who actually belonged. She wasn't just visiting Manila. She was trying to understand why her old friend suddenly wanted to stay. I took her to the community center one afternoon. She sat quietly in the back of the room watching me teach, watching Sophia raise her hand, eager to answer every question. Afterward, Linda didn't say much, but I noticed something had shifted in the way she looked at me. That evening, over dinner, she finally said it. "Susan, I came here thinking I would convince you to come home. Now I think I'm just going to ask why you didn't do this sooner." I didn't have an answer for that either. Maybe some of us need to lose everything familiar before we're willing to find something new. After Linda went home, life settled into a rhythm I never could have imagined back in Seattle. Mornings began with coffee on my small balcony, watching the city wake up. Twice a week, I walked to the community center to teach my class, which had grown from 8 students to nearly 20. I made friends, both local and expat. A small group of us met every Saturday at the same open-air market. What started as a simple weekend activity felt like a genuine community, and for the first time since my divorce, I had something that depended on me, not in a heavy way, not in an overwhelming way, just enough to matter. Of course, not everything was easy. There were frustrations, traffic that could turn a 20-minute trip into 2 hours, heat that took months to get used to, power outages, enough paperwork to test the patience of a saint. There were days I missed Seattle terribly, the rain, the familiar streets, the library where I'd spent so much of my life. There were moments I wished I could sit down with old friends and talk about the life we once shared. Those feelings were real, but so was everything else. The friendships, the laughter, the students, the feeling of being part of something again. About a year after I arrived, I faced my first real crisis. I got sick. Nothing serious in the end, but at the time, I didn't know that. I woke up one morning with a high fever and no idea what was wrong with me. I was alone in my apartment, thousands of miles from anyone I had known my entire life. For a moment, pure panic set in. What had I done, moving here alone at my age, with no family to check on me? But then, something remarkable happened. I called May from the coffee shop, not sure what else to do. Within the hour, she was at my door with her mother, who happened to be a nurse. They took me to a nearby clinic, stayed with me the entire time. May's mother held my hand in the waiting room like I was family, not a stranger she'd met only through her daughter. It turned out to be a bad case of food poisoning, nothing life-threatening. But that night taught me something I hadn't expected to learn. I wasn't as alone as I feared. Thousands of miles from my blood family, I had found something else entirely. A family built not by birth, but by choice, by kindness, by showing up for one another. When I told Linda about what happened during our next Sunday call, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I've never forgotten. Maybe you didn't lose your support system when you left Seattle. Maybe you just hadn't built the new one yet. She was right, and that realization changed something in me. I stopped holding back. I stopped keeping people at arm's length the way I had, without even realizing it. I let myself belong here, completely. 2 years passed. My English classes grew larger still. The community center asked me to train other volunteers. Sophia, my bright young student, was accepted into a teacher training program at her university. She cried when she told me. Then she hugged me and said, "Teacher Susan, you did this. You believed in me." I told her the truth. She had done the work. I had just shown up. But showing up turned out to matter more than I ever realized. My pension still wasn't much, but here it stretched further than it ever had in Seattle. I could afford a comfortable apartment, good food, occasional trips to nearby islands, and still have something left over each month. For the first time in years, money wasn't a constant source of quiet anxiety, but the money was never really the point. What changed most wasn't my bank account. It was me. I thought about Linda's question often. "Susan, what if something happens to you over there?" Something did happen to me over there. I came back to life. There's a particular memory I return to often from around that time. It was a quiet evening. I was walking home from the community center. The sun was setting over the rooftops, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I stopped for a moment on a small footbridge over a canal near my apartment, and I realized I was humming a song to myself, something I hadn't done in years. I stood there for a long time, just listening to the city, the tricycles, the distant music from a nearby house, the laughter of children playing somewhere I couldn't see. And I thought to myself, "Susan, you are happy." It had been so long since I'd been able to say that sentence and mean it. I don't want to pretend everything became perfect. It didn't. There are still hard days. Days when the distance from everyone I once knew feels especially wide. Days when I wonder what my life would look like if I had stayed in Seattle. But those days are fewer now, and they don't carry the same weight they once did. A few months ago, Sophia visited me during a break from her studies. She's taller now, more confident, more ambitious. We spent the afternoon talking about her plans for the future, her own classroom someday, students of her own, dreams that once felt impossible to her. At one point, she looked at me and said something that caught me completely off guard. She said, "Teacher Susan, I'm glad you came to the Philippines. Not thank you, not congratulations, just that. I'm glad you came to the Philippines." I don't think she realized how much those words meant to me, because the truth is, I'm glad I came too. Not because it solved every problem. not because it erased every year of loneliness that came before it. Nothing can do that. I'm glad I came because it reminded me that life isn't finished simply because one chapter ends. A marriage can end. A career can end. But that doesn't mean your story is over. There can be another chapter, another beginning, another version of yourself waiting somewhere you never expected to find it. People still ask me sometimes if I'll ever move back to the United States. I always tell them the same thing. Never say never. Life has surprised me before. It will probably surprise me again. But for now, when I wake up each morning and hear the city coming to life outside my window, I know exactly where I want to be. And that feeling took me a very long time to find. Looking back now, there's a stretch of my life in Manila I almost never talk about because it doesn't fit neatly into the story people expect. About 18 months in, right around the time my classes were thriving, and I finally felt like I had found my footing, I went through a period where I genuinely considered going home. It wasn't one single event, it was an accumulation of small things. A visa renewal that took 3 visits to 3 different offices and cost me an entire week of patience I didn't know I had. A landlord who raised my rent without much warning, forcing me to recalculate a budget I thought I had finally figured out. A stomach bug that lingered for nearly 2 weeks and left me too tired to walk to class, which meant I had to cancel sessions I had never canceled before. Small things, but they piled up the way small things do, until one evening I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea gone cold and asked myself, quite seriously, whether I had made a mistake. I wrote Linda a long email that night. Not a phone call, an email, because I didn't trust my voice not to crack. I told her I was tired. I told her that maybe 73 was too old to keep proving a point to nobody in particular. I told her I missed rain that fell straight down instead of sideways in a typhoon, and I missed knowing exactly which bus to take without asking 3 strangers first. She didn't respond right away, and for 2 days I assumed she agreed with me, that she thought it was finally time to come home. When she did write back, her email was short. She said, "Susan, tired is not the same as wrong. Ask yourself if you're tired of Manila or tired of being brave for so long without a rest." I read that sentence more times than I'd like to admit. I decided to give myself permission to rest, properly rest, for the first time since I'd arrived. I told the community center I needed 2 weeks away from teaching. I stopped forcing myself out the door every single day. I let myself sleep late, order food instead of cooking, and simply exist without pushing toward anything. By the end of those 2 weeks, something had settled in me. I realized I wasn't tired of my life here. I was tired the way anyone gets tired when they've spent months being strong, without acknowledging that strength has a cost. When I walked back into that classroom after my break, Sophia had made a small welcome sign with the other students. Nothing elaborate, just a piece of poster board with "Welcome back, Teacher Susan," written in careful handwriting. I stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone noticed me, and I felt something I can only describe as gratitude so large it nearly knocked me over. That period taught me something I hadn't expected to learn at 73 years old. Starting over doesn't mean the doubt disappears. It means you learn to sit with the doubt without letting it drive the car. I still have days now, even years into this life, where I wonder if I made the right choice. But I no longer treat that wondering as an emergency. It's just weather. It passes. There's another part of this story I think about often, one that has nothing to do with grand realizations and everything to do with the ordinary texture of daily life here. I never expected to fall in love with something as small as the local market on Saturday mornings, but I did. The vendors know my name now. Mang Rick, who sells the best mangoes I've ever tasted in my life, always sets aside the ripest ones for me before the crowd arrives. Aling Fei, who runs the little stall with handmade woven bags, taught me a handful of local phrases over the course of a year, correcting my pronunciation with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoys teaching. These relationships, small as they might sound to someone hearing about them secondhand, became the scaffolding of my new life. In Seattle near the end, I had a life built almost entirely of habits and appointments. Here, I built a life out of relationships, one small kindness at a time, one shared joke at a time, one Saturday morning at a time. I didn't plan it that way. It simply happened, the way roots happen underground long before anyone notices the tree above the surface has grown taller. I also want to talk honestly about my health, because I think people my age deserve honesty on this subject, rather than the polished version of these stories. Living abroad at 72, and now well past it, means thinking about medical care differently than I ever had to in the United States. I researched hospitals before I even booked my flight. I made sure I understood what my insurance would and wouldn't cover. I found a doctor here, a kind man named Dr. Santos, within my first 2 months, specifically so I wouldn't be searching for one during an emergency. That preparation mattered more than I expected. Beyond the food poisoning scare I mentioned earlier, I've had 2 other health scares since then. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to remind me that 72 doesn't stop being 72 just because you've moved somewhere warmer. Both times, the care I received was thorough, affordable, and delivered with a warmth I genuinely hadn't expected. Both times, May or one of my students or someone from my little community here showed up before I even had to ask. I share this because I think the fear people have about aging abroad, alone, without family nearby, is a real and valid fear. I had it too. What I didn't expect was that the solution to that fear wasn't staying somewhere familiar. It was building a new kind of family, one that showed up just as reliably as blood relatives might have, sometimes more reliably than the distant acquaintances I'd been quietly relying on back home without fully realizing it. The funny thing is, when I sat at that gate in Seattle at 72 years old, I thought I was traveling to the Philippines. Looking back, I wasn't, not really. I was traveling toward a version of myself I thought had disappeared somewhere along the way, somewhere between a quiet divorce and a retirement that felt like an ending instead of a beginning. And after all these years, I finally found her. If you're watching this and you're standing at your own crossroads, wondering if it's too late to start something new, I want you to know it isn't. I was 72 years old, with 2 suitcases and a small pension when I started over. If I could do it, so can you. Whatever your version of that airport looks like, I hope you find the courage to walk toward it. People sometimes ask me what I would say to someone my age who is sitting where I once sat, staring at a small apartment, a shrinking bank account, and a life that feels like it's already been fully written. I never have a tidy answer because I don't think there is one. But I can tell them what I know now that I didn't know then. I know that fear rarely disappears before you act. It simply gets quieter once you're moving, because you're too busy handling what's actually in front of you to keep imagining what might go wrong. I know that loneliness is not a life sentence, even when it feels like one. It is often just a signal that you haven't yet built the life that fits the person you're becoming. I know that money matters, of course it matters, but it was never the thing that changed my life. What changed my life was purpose, small and unglamorous as it sometimes was. A classroom, a coffee shop conversation, a Saturday market, a young woman named Sophia who reminded me without ever meaning to that I still had something worth giving. I think about the version of myself who sat in that airport in Seattle so often now. She was terrified. She had no idea what she was doing. She thought she might be making the biggest mistake of her life, and some days she genuinely believed she was. I wish I could go back and tell her what I know now, that the fear she was feeling wasn't a sign she was going the wrong direction. It was simply the sound a life makes when it's about to grow again after a long, quiet winter. I don't know how many years I have left. Nobody does at any age, though we like to pretend otherwise when we're young. But I know that whatever years remain, I intend to keep living them rather than simply enduring them. I intend to keep walking to that market on Saturday mornings, keep standing in front of that small classroom twice a week, keep calling Linda every Sunday, and keep reminding myself on the harder days that starting over was never really about the Philippines at all. It was about refusing to let the last chapter be written by grief, or by loneliness, or by the quiet assumption that 72 is too old to begin again. It isn't. I am living proof that it isn't. Thank you for listening to my story.